You think saving one man makes you a hero? You're done here. Claire, pack your things. The words echoed across the cold hospital office. But outside, in the trauma bay, a man had lived because she did. She didn't ask for insurance. She didn't wait for forms. She just pressed her hands against an open artery and saved a life. 6 hours later, the hospital lobby went silent because 25 Marines in full dress uniform had just walked in and they weren't there for the paperwork. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Friday night had settled over Lexington, Kentucky, but inside Fairwinds Memorial Hospital, time didn't slow. Twanxious families hovering near vending machines that hummed like white noise in the background. Bright fluorescent lights bleached the walls and floors, giving everything a sharp, clinical edge. But Claire Donnelly barely noticed the light anymore. At 32, with 8 years of trauma nursing under her belt, she moved through the chaos with a calm that came only from having seen the worst and still choosing to return the next day. Her dark auburn hair was tied back in a low ponytail. Her navy blue scrubs bore faint traces of iodine, adhesive, and life remnants of lives saved, and some lost. Claire wasn't just any nurse. She was the senior triage nurse of the ER, the one residents deferred to in a pinch, the one new nurses turned to when a child seized in their arms or a trauma rolled in bloody and breathless. And she carried her past with quiet weight. Her father, a retired Navy corpsman, had served 3 tours in Vietnam. Growing up, Claire had watched him treat wounds in silence, never raising his voice, never speaking of the war, just quietly patching up neighbors' cuts. Setting a broken arm once, always helping before asking. He used to say, in a real emergency, your conscience has to move faster than the rules. Claire had never forgotten that, but lately, the rules were moving slower than ever. Under new ownership, Fairwinds Memorial had implemented a strict patient intake policy. No patient could receive treatment beyond vitals without first providing insurance information and completing digital intake. Even emergencies had to wait. Claire had already been written up twice in the past 4 months for protocol violations. Once, it was a toddler with an allergic reaction. The second, a woman with an ectopic pregnancy. Both times, Claire had moved faster than the paperwork, and both times, she was told one more infraction and she'd be out. That Friday night, the policy weighed heavy on her shoulders as she moved between triage rooms, checking IVs, giving quiet direction to younger nurses, and ignoring the sideways looks from one nurse in particular, Nancy Ellison. Nancy had been there almost as long as Claire, but they couldn't have been more different. By the book, unyielding. If we all break the rules, Nancy had once told her bluntly, then we don't have a system. And without a system, we have chaos. To Claire, chaos was letting people bleed while a clerk typed in an address. It was an old argument, one neither had won. But Claire had another memory on her mind that night. Her mother, Ellen Donnelly, a nurse 2 decades ago, let go after she filed a complaint about patient neglect in a senior care unit. The system had crushed her for speaking up. Claire had been 12 when she watched her mother box up her scrubs for the last time. She never forgot that silence either. The clock struck 11:47 p.m. when the ER doors flew open and a man stumbled in his left sleeve soaked in crimson. He was mid-40s, pale, unshaven, sweat beading across his brow. He pressed his right hand to his arm, trying in vain to hold the bleeding in. "Help," he whispered. "Please." Claire was already moving, her instinct flaring. Blood drops spattered the glossy tile as he staggered toward the triage desk. Nancy saw him, too, but she didn't move. "Sir, please go to registration first," she called out, pointing to the intake window. "We need your insurance information." Claire stepped forward, steady but sharp. "His pressure's crashing," she said under her breath. "That's arterial." Nancy blocked her path. "Claire, you know the rules. I know what bleeding out looks like. He's not cleared. Don't make this worse." But Claire had already taken a glove from her pocket, pressing down on the wound with one hand, while guiding him toward Trauma Bay 2. The man collapsed onto the gurney as she held firm pressure. "What's your name?" she asked quickly, trying to keep him conscious. "Walter," he murmured. "Walter Granger." "Okay, Walter. You're safe now. Stay with me." She waved over a med tech and called down the hallway. "I need Dr. Langston in Bay 2. Now we've got arterial hemorrhage. Left arm possible brachial." Nancy stood frozen outside the trauma bay, hands clenched, jaw set. Claire didn't look back. Within moments, Dr. Langston arrived and took over, barking out orders: IV fluids, vitals, blood type, and cross. Claire stayed in the room, relaying her assessment, then assisting with pressure and prep. She didn't breathe until Walter was wheeled into the OR. Only then did the adrenaline subside and the cold air return. Nancy was waiting at the nurse's station, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. "You just made your third strike." Claire peeled off her gloves, hands still shaking slightly. "I saved a life," she said softly. Nancy didn't answer. She just walked toward the administrator's office. By 1 orange a.m., Claire was called into a disciplinary review. Dr. Douglas Hale, the hospital administrator, sat behind his desk, flanked by HR and a printed packet. She still had dried blood on her sleeve. "Ms. Donnelly," he began, voice flat, "this marks your third violation of established intake protocol. We have clear expectations in this department." Claire didn't blink. "Walter Granger would have died if I had followed your expectations." "That's not your decision to make," Hale said. "Protocols exist to protect the hospital from liability. And what protects the patient?" He leaned back in his chair. "This isn't personal, it's procedure. We can't make exceptions for judgment calls." Claire's voice was low but steady. "My judgment is based on 8 years of trauma nursing. That's more than a policy can see in 10 minutes. There was a pause, cold, heavy. "I understand," she added. "If you have to terminate me." Hale closed the folder but didn't respond. Claire left the office knowing one thing: she had crossed the line. But in her heart, it was the right line to cross. Back in the break room, nurses murmured. Some whispered in corners. Others stared at their phones. Tina McCall, Claire's closest friend on the floor, approached with red-rimmed eyes. "Whatever happens," Tina said quietly, "I'm proud of you." Nancy passed by without a word, and somewhere in the quiet hum of overhead lights and coffee machines, a phone pinged. A staff member had uploaded security footage of the incident. Claire's standoff with Nancy, the bleeding man. The decision, it had already been shared 26 times. Claire sat down on the bench, her back to the wall, the gravity of it all beginning to settle. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion, one thought returned clear and stubborn, like her father's old voice echoing in the back of her mind. In a real emergency, your conscience has to move faster than the rules. And that night, it had, even if the cost was still unknown. The operating room lights had dimmed, the machines had stabilized, and Walter Granger was going to live. The emergency repair to the severed artery had worked. Dr. Langston later said they were 2 minutes, maybe less, from losing him. Claire stayed until Walter was safely transferred to post-op. She never once let go of his arm until a surgical clamp took over. But the moment she walked out of Trauma Bay 2, the celebration was short-lived. Nancy Ellison was already standing outside the bay, arms crossed, a printed incident report in hand. She didn't look angry. She looked satisfied. "You forced my hand," she said. "I've already spoken to Dr. Hale. You'll be expected in his office within the hour." Claire didn't reply. She pulled off her blood-streaked gloves, dropped them into the biohazard bin, and walked away without a word. In the small conference room beside administration, Dr. Douglas Hale sat like a man preparing for court. A thick folder of documentation lay in front of him. HR rep on one side, Nancy on the other. Claire, alone. Her scrub top still bore the faint stain of Walter's blood. She hadn't changed. She hadn't had time. Claire, Hale began, his voice tight. You were warned. This was your third infraction of our intake policy. I understand. You initiated treatment on a patient without prior registration, no insurance verification, no signed consent, no digital file. He was bleeding out, Claire said quietly. You want me to let someone die because the system hasn't caught up. We have policies to protect this institution, legally and financially. Deviating from those puts everyone at risk. And what about the patient's risk? Hale exhaled sharply. This isn't about compassion, Claire. It's about consistency. If every nurse made her own judgment, then maybe more people would survive. She cut in. Nancy leaned forward, voice colder than the air-conditioned room. This hospital is not a battlefield. It's a system, and systems only work if every part follows the rules. Claire didn't look at Nancy. She looked at Dr. Hale. Last month, she said, her voice even, we lost a man with cardiac symptoms. Sat in the waiting room 40 minutes. Nobody dared move him because his paperwork wasn't finished. That case was reviewed, Hale replied. Reviewed, Claire echoed. He died sitting upright in a chair. The silence was dense. We are not here to rehash other cases, Hale said. We're here to discuss your insubordination. Claire stood, calm, steady. Then consider this my last shift. She walked out without waiting for a verdict. Back in the break room, news of the confrontation had already begun to spread. But it wasn't whispered rumors this time. It was footage. A blurry hallway camera had caught the exchange, Claire pulling Walter from the lobby, Nancy stepping in, the refusal, the defiance. Someone had leaked it to the nurses' group chat by too narrow a match. It had gone beyond internal channels. By sunrise, it was on Facebook. A caption read, "This man would have died in the waiting room. One nurse broke the rules. One stopped her. You decide who did the right thing." The hospital's nursing staff quickly became divided. Some rallied behind Claire, angry that administrative rules had overshadowed common sense. They wore small blue pins with her initials, C.D., clipped to their badges. Others stayed silent, nervous, afraid of losing their jobs or being next. Tina McCall, Claire's closest friend in the department, didn't stay silent. She began documenting other near-misses cases where the intake policy had delayed urgent care, diabetic crashes, respiratory arrests, elderly patients slumped in wheelchairs. She created an anonymous spreadsheet with dates, vitals, and outcomes. It grew fast. By the end of the week, they had 42 documented cases of delayed care directly linked to the new protocol. And then came the unexpected visitor. Late Sunday morning, just before shift change, a quiet man in his 60s walked through the automatic doors and asked for Claire by name. He wore no stethoscope, no clipboard, just a pressed beige jacket, VA pin on the collar, and a distant look in his eyes. "Is Nurse Donnelly here?" Tina met him at the entrance. "She's not on shift today." "May I ask, I'm Dr. Richard Kessler," he said, retired military, served as trauma lead with the 385th Medical Battalion in Iraq. He paused, looked toward the ER hallway, and added, "I heard about what she did." Tina led him to the break room. A few nurses gathered, recognizing the name. Kessler spoke calmly, slowly, like someone used to field medics in sandstorms. "In combat," he said, "we were trained to treat first, ask later, rank, name. Country, it didn't matter. If they bled, we stopped it. If they cried, we helped them breathe." He looked around the room, and now, in peacetime, in one of the most advanced hospitals in America, a nurse has to ask for permission to save a man's life. No one answered, but they didn't have to. His words lingered like an open wound. By Tuesday morning, local media had picked up the story. The footage had gone viral, now featured in a WKYT segment titled, "Rules or Rescue Nurse Suspended After Saving Dying Man Without Intake Form." A reporter stood outside Fairwinds Memorial. Interviews rolled in from patients, nurses, and even former staff. Tina was approached for comment, but declined. She wasn't ready to speak, but one person was. Walter Granger, now recovering steadily, spoke to the press from his hospital bed. "She didn't know who I was," he said, voice thin but clear. Didn't ask, didn't hesitate, just helped. He held up his arm, now bandaged and healing. "This isn't just a wound. It's a statement. She acted like a nurse is supposed to." The clip aired that evening. Claire watched it from her apartment couch, blanket wrapped around her knees. She hadn't left home in 2 days. But now, something stirred. Something bigger than just her own case. By Thursday, the Kentucky Nurses Coalition had issued a public letter. In it, they warned that rigid hospital intake procedures were endangering lives. They cited Claire's case by name, and within the halls of Fairwinds, an uneasy tension grew. HR was swamped with inquiries. Administrators were tight-lipped, and Nancy Ellison. She kept to herself, but Claire had heard whispers. Even some of Nancy's former allies were beginning to question whether they'd stood on the wrong side of the line. Back in the break room, the staff gathered again. This time, Dr. Kessler returned with a prepared statement. He read it aloud before handing it to the local press. "No nurse," he began, "should have to choose between saving a life and saving her job. Not in this country. Not ever." He folded the paper neatly, placed it on the table, and said quietly, "She did what I was trained to do. That makes her a combat medic in my book, and we don't abandon our own." Claire, listening from outside the door, felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, something closer to resolve. The media storm hadn't peaked yet, but it was coming. Claire could feel it like thunder in the distance. 2 days after the leaked footage, a press van pulled into the hospital lot, then two more. Reporters gathered near the front entrance, waiting for a soundbite, a face, a reaction. And then it happened. Captain Megan Granger stepped out of a black SUV, uniform crisp, medals gleaming against her chest. Her presence turned every head. She wasn't just a Marine. She was Walter Granger's daughter, and she had just returned from deployment in the Middle East. She didn't wait for the cameras to find her. She walked directly to the press podium that had been set up beside the ER entrance. Her voice was calm, measured but unshakable. "I'm Captain Megan Granger of the United States Marine Corps. My father, Walter Granger, would not be alive today if not for Nurse Claire Donnelly." She let that sentence sit. She didn't know who he was. She didn't ask for ID, rank, or insurance. She saw a man bleeding and she chose to act. That's what we call honor. There were no follow-up questions. No one dared interrupt. Megan turned, saluted the flag above the entrance, and walked back to her car. The video hit national networks within hours. Social media exploded. "Stand with Claire" began trending in 3 states. And Fairwinds Memorial. They doubled down. By Friday morning, Dr. Douglas Hale stepped in front of a small crowd of reporters with a statement in hand. "We appreciate the public's concern," he said, tightly, "but hospitals cannot function without protocol. We regret that Nurse Donnelly made unauthorized decisions that could have exposed the facility to liability." He paused, then delivered the blow. Effective immediately, her employment with Fairwinds Memorial is terminated. It was official. Claire was out, but the story didn't end there. The next morning, something unusual happened. 17 nurses from the ER called in sick. By noon, that number climbed to 26. By end of shift, over half the ER staff had walked out in silent protest. The remaining staff scrambled to fill beds, place IVs, answer calls. Temp nurses were flown in from Louisville and Nashville, but the rhythm of the ER was broken. And everyone felt it. Patients waited longer. Families grew frustrated. And outside the hospital, a crowd had formed, holding signs, Protocols don't save lives. People do. Nurses are not robots. Reinstate Claire Donnelly. Fairwinds had never seen anything like it. Claire stayed home, phone on silent, blinds half drawn. She didn't want to be seen as a symbol. She just wanted to save lives. But now, it was no longer just about her. It was about the system. And then, 6 hours after her termination, the parking lot filled again, but not with press vans this time. They came in quietly. Black government SUVs, a transport van, a row of motorcycles. 25 United States Marines, dressed in full ceremonial blues, walked in formation toward the hospital entrance. No words, no shouting, just boots, steady, unified. They lined the hospital lobby shoulder to shoulder, faces solemn, eyes forward. Patients paused, nurses froze, visitors lowered their voices. Even the administrators upstairs felt the shift in air pressure. At the center of it all stood Captain Megan Granger, hands behind her back. "We're not here to make trouble," she said to the security staff. "We're here to honor the woman who saved our own." Word spread quickly. Claire was contacted by Tina, who whispered, "You need to come down here. You really need to see this." Claire hesitated. She hadn't been back since the firing, but something told her this moment wasn't about her fear. It was about her presence. She arrived through the back door, walked past the break room where she'd once handed out donuts during night shift, past the hallway where she'd first held pressure on Walter's wound, and then she stepped into the lobby. Every Marine in that room turned and saluted in unison. The sound was sharp, precise, final. Claire stopped in her tracks. Tears didn't come, but something cracked open in her chest. She took one more step, and then she saw him. Walter Granger, thin but standing, supported on each side by 2 Marines. He looked smaller than before, but stronger somehow. He moved slowly toward her, and when they met, he wrapped his arms around her with quiet force. "You didn't see my medals," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you saw I was dying. That's what being a nurse is. That's what being a human being is." She held on to him, steadying his frame. The entire lobby stood still. Some nurses cried. Others just stood in awe. Even hospital security said nothing. The silence was louder than any protest. Upstairs, Dr. Hale watched from behind the tinted window of his office. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched. The PR team had no answers. Phones buzzed with calls from state health officials, veteran advocacy groups, and even a few senators' offices. And at that exact moment, another figure arrived. A tall man in a dark blue suit, Marine lapel pin on his chest, walked through the lobby doors. He introduced himself simply. "I'm Congressman Aaron Whitfield, 12th District, retired USMC. He stood next to Walter, then looked directly into the news cameras. "I've come to thank Claire Donnelly, not just for saving a veteran, but for reminding all of us what medicine is supposed to be about." He turned to the hospital entrance. "And I'm calling for an immediate investigation into administrative policies at Fairwinds Memorial that put red tape over human life." The crowd erupted, cameras flashed, applause echoed off the walls. Claire stood frozen, not in fear, but in awe. This was bigger than her now. Back outside, more cars arrived. Veterans, families, nurses from other hospitals. By late afternoon, the crowd had tripled. Signs went up. Songs played from speakers. And above it all stood one nurse who hadn't asked for attention, who had only asked for time to stop the bleeding. Now, it was her country's turn to stop the bleeding in its healthcare system. And for the first time since the night it all began, Claire allowed herself to breathe. Deep, clear, free. She had stood alone, but now she stood among her own. The crowd outside Fairwinds Memorial didn't thin that evening. If anything, it grew louder, stronger, more unified. By morning, the hospital board called an emergency meeting, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The story had reached Washington, and with Congressman Aaron Whitfield's presence on national television, silence was no longer an option. Inside the boardroom, the air was thick. Some argued for damage control, others for public apology, but it was Dr. Patricia Monroe, the board chair and herself a former Navy surgeon, who finally stood. "I've reviewed everything," she said firmly, "and we're no longer talking about one nurse. We're talking about the soul of this institution." The board voted unanimously. It was time to fix what had been broken. Claire was invited to return, not just as a nurse, but as something more. The offer came with full reinstatement, a public apology, and a promotion to Director of Emergency Nursing Operations. But Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat across from Dr. Monroe and said one sentence: "I don't want a title unless I can use it to fix the system." Monroe nodded slowly. "What do you have in mind?" That same week, Claire stood in front of a packed hospital auditorium. Press, staff, patients, veterans, students, all seated, all waiting. She took the microphone with both hands, voice steady. "I'm grateful to be offered my job back," she began, "but I didn't fight for my career. I fought because a man was dying and I had to choose between a rule and a life." She let the silence sit. "Going forward, this hospital will establish an independent nurse advocacy council made up of frontline nurses and patient representatives. It will review all policies that affect emergency treatment, and its decisions will carry real authority." She looked directly at Dr. Hale, seated in the second row. "No nurse here will ever again have to choose between doing what's right and doing what's written." The room erupted in applause. 3 days later, the front lobby plaque changed. Where it once read, "Fairwinds Emergency Unit," it now read, "The Walter Granger Emergency Wing." A ribbon-cutting ceremony followed. Veterans lined the walls in dress blues. Walter stood beside Claire, a cane in one hand, her arm in the other. They didn't need to speak. The quiet between them said everything. The months that followed brought even more change. Claire used her new position to initiate training reforms, rewriting intake procedures to allow nurses discretion in triage critical moments. She worked with legal teams to shield nurses from retaliation when acting in good faith. She also helped launch a foundation built entirely from community donations and veteran support. The Claire Donnelly Nursing Fund offered scholarships to students entering trauma and emergency care, especially those from underrepresented communities. Her only condition: recipients must pledge to never look away when someone is bleeding. National media revisited her story during Nurses Week. Segments aired across CNN, CBS, and even PBS, highlighting how a single nurse, in a single moment, had triggered policy changes across 19 hospital systems nationwide. The American Nurses Association invited her to speak. She declined. Instead, she sent a letter: "Give the microphone to someone who's still in scrubs at 3 a.m. holding a patient's hand." That's where the real leadership is. 5 years later, the emergency department buzzed with its usual chaos. Claire, now in her early 40s, walked the halls with quiet presence. Not above anyone, not removed, just aware. She no longer wore a badge that said supervisor. Instead, it read Chief Nursing Officer. But titles had never mattered much to her. That afternoon, a patient was wheeled in. No ID, no insurance. A new nurse, barely out of school, glanced toward the registration desk, uncertain. Then, she glanced at Claire. Claire didn't say a word, just nodded gently. The young nurse moved immediately, guiding the patient to the bay and starting vitals. Claire watched from the hallway, hands folded, heart still, and then it hit her, a moment of full circle clarity. She stepped into the supply room, sat down, let herself breathe, and in that quiet, she heard her father's voice. It wasn't memory, it was something deeper. "The law protects heroes, Claire, but sometime you have to break the law to be one." She smiled, not for herself, but for every nurse, medic, and soul who had ever stood at the edge, choosing action over protocol, humanity over hesitation. The system hadn't been fixed overnight. It never would be. But thanks to Claire Donnelly, it had moved one step closer to remembering that behind every chart, every form, every scan was a human being, worth saving, and some rules, they were meant to be rewritten.